Hello and welcome to the Fit for Privacy Podcast, the podcast for those who care about privacy. I'm your host Punit, and here we have conversations with industry leaders about their perspectives, ideas and opinions relating to privacy and data protection matters. Before we start, a quick disclaimer that the views and opinions expressed are not legal advice. So let's get started. Hello and welcome. In the Fit for Privacy podcast, we have a unique instance. We have two guests at one time, and I'm talking about Chris Casale and Ryan Smith. Chris Casale is a senior operations technology and business strategy director with experience in collaborating amongst leadership teams and interacting with clients. He guides strategic growth throughout departments, coaches and trains people, and develops new processes for improvement. And he has a Master's of Science degree in cybersecurity, and he implements new compliance standards for operational efficiency. Welcome, Chris.
Glad to be here.
And Ryan. Ryan Smith is an international marketing speaker with focus on helping businesses grow their revenue. And he helps them grow their revenue through marketing by mixing inbound marketing, SEO marketing, social media, paid media, and analytics. Welcome, Ryan.
Hello, thank you.
And together, you help multinational companies across the globe, as well as SMBs and entrepreneurs and startups, with informed marketing, digital marketing trends, strategies, and tactics to move their business forward. So thank you so much for being here. And I also know that both of you together host a podcast named Happy Hour Marketing Podcast, which is a very interesting podcast if someone is having a business and they want to learn tips and tricks for marketing. So, marketing and privacy, that's an interesting combination. People think privacy is anti-marketing or GDPR is anti-marketing. So how do you define GDPR in one word? Maybe one word for each one of you just to get us started.
One word to describe GDPR, compliance, law.
Yeah, I was kind of going with that too. Law. That's really the best way to sum it up.
That's as simple as that. Law. I can understand that, and compliance. It is like that. And we hear that when in privacy field, we hear that GDPR is anti-marketing. And the reason I have you guys is because we typically hear from privacy professionals and their perspective on privacy. It will be interesting to have someone in marketing and hear their perspective on privacy. So what do you think? Is GDPR or this e-privacy regulation on all these privacy laws really anti-marketing? Is that really how people feel on the ground?
You know, that's an interesting question. I think people are afraid of it because of the fines that are associated with it. The other thing that's interesting is that because Ryan and I work with an international audience, those outside of the EU start to question whether or not they actually have to comply with the law. And our standard or our belief is that it's possible to have both. It's possible to have marketing as well as the privacy compliance laws that go with it. It just gives you a different lens to look at things through. And I think people should naturally be a little bit suspicious when it comes to companies that have their data. I think we learned in the Cambridge Analytica scandal several years ago now with Facebook that not everything companies do with your data is on the up and up. And so privacy is very important from a consumer standpoint. But the flip side of that is I don't think it's something to be afraid of. I actually think it's a way to have sort of better quality in your marketing, right? Establishing relationships with people that want to have a relationship with you. And that forces you to do a better job with your marketing, which in the grand scheme of things really helps out everyone.
That's interesting. And Ryan, you have the same view or different view?
No, very much the same. By nature, I'm a marketing strategist. And it's interesting because when you create a marketing strategy, the first thing we look at is who is the audience. You have to know before you're creating is understand the audience. And part of understanding that audience is where do they live? And when we start looking at GDPR from an international standpoint, you can be in the United States. Now, California does have their own Consumer Privacy Act. so, which is very much kind of like GDPR light. You can sort of think of it that way. But outside of that, you have to understand who your audience is. And when you start to market and you start to target people within the EU, you have to comply to that. So, with marketing, we talked about one word, it's law. And as a marketing strategist, we have to dig deep and really understand each of the markets that you're targeting and what are the laws. So this does affect everybody, whether you're in the EU or not. It is really best to comply and sort of follow those standards set. And to
Yeah.
Chris's point, you can have
Yeah.
both.
So essentially, from where I see, because I follow you, marketing is more of a creative thing, wherein you need to think, imagine, create, and say, who's my ideal customer? How do I get to them? And then compliance is more of a pull back, saying, don't do this, don't do that. These are the rules. While in marketing, you say, let go of the rules, let go of the inhibitions, and think crazily. So how do the two work together? What I mean, when you're giving advice, how does it work?
Well, kind of as Ryan mentioned, we've always focused on the audience perspective, right? If you're a business or you're a small to medium-sized business, a startup, even a large organization, who is it you are trying to reach with your product or service? And I think that the interesting thing about this is that the digital sort of revolution now has allowed people to get a little bit lazy. And what I mean by that is if you think back to the history of what marketing was, right, going back to like the 1960s and 70s, it was very interruption based, right? Organizations would buy a spot on TV, or they would buy a spot on the radio, or maybe they would take out newspaper ads, and they would try to disrupt or interrupt what consumers were doing so that they would take notice of that product or service offering, right? And then what happened is in the 90s with the digital revolution and the internet taking everything by storm, it kind of changed that perspective because it allowed people to block out interruptions. And so then it became much more information, much more consumer driven, right? And so the purpose of it sort of became, well, if you are a business that's offering something, you've got to show people why you're the best at it. And so you need to be putting stuff out there that's helpful and beneficial to them. I really think that a lot of these laws that we're seeing, a lot of the privacy settings that we're seeing in apps, like, Apple just announced a couple weeks ago for iOS 14, is just sort of the next evolution in that, right? It puts the power in the hands of the consumers. So the advice that we always give businesses is to figure out where your audience lives, works, and plays, and then make your marketing so useful that they want to receive it, that they opt in to receive it.
That's interesting. And do they ask sometimes, like saying, can we do it because of the privacy laws? Can we do it because of CCPA? Can we do it because of GDPR? Do they actually ask that question? Is that on their minds at all times or sometimes?
I think we're getting to a point now where people are becoming more educated on this, whether you live in an area that is sort of has to fall under the GDPR or not. You're seeing websites that at the bottom sort of have the dialogue that lets you know about collecting cookies and so forth. So I think maybe a year or two ago, it was so new, people might not be sure. But like anything, there's a frequency to visiting websites and seeing the little disclaimer at the bottom that I believe now most users on the internet are used to seeing it. And this is for, your two guests here who do not live in an area that's sort of governed and falls under the GDPR, and we're still used to seeing that on a variety of websites. So when asking for it, I think, yes, you do, and you have to let people know what you're using it for. Sign up for our newsletter. You might receive promotional offers, things like that. I think letting them know, but this is becoming more ubiquitous, and I don't think it's as much of a deterrent as maybe it was at the beginning.
So people are getting used to it. People are getting more accustomed to that. When we are running a campaign, we need to be aware, we need to be sensitive of the fact that there is a privacy law, and it may create some requirements like having a checkbox, having a notice, having a link to privacy statement. So those things in the companies you are working with, it's more a reality now.
I think absolutely that's the case. And the nice thing about that is that a lot of the tools that marketers use are now building those feature sets into it, which makes it easier for businesses that maybe don't have the context of how to be fully GDPR compliant. It becomes an option for them. So if you're using marketing automation software now to build a landing page and to build a form, there's just simple checkboxes for, yes, I want to ensure compliance, and that will put the appropriate checkboxes on the form. And I think kind of to Ryan's point, even if you were late to comply with GDPR or some of these other laws, this is becoming the reality, right? This is the trend that we're moving towards. And even if it's not specifically a law, Google announced starting next year, third-party cookies are going away. So you're going to see less tracking features available. Apple is enacting in iOS 14 these privacy settings where individuals can choose which apps they want to allow to track them and when. Google recently announced they're probably going to be doing the same thing with Android pretty soon here. So this is just the reality of the world that we live in now, and the businesses that get that and comply early come up with a better long-term strategy to be successful.
And then go ahead, Ryan.
Just to add on to what he's saying, from a marketing perspective, especially with the third-party cookies, Google made the big announcement, but Google, in a way, is late to the game. Safari has already blocked this. Mozilla has had this for 2 years now already. So now Google is the most used when we're talking about the browsers. So that is what made it big news, and it's Google itself. But as marketers, when we're going through this sort of transition, and in the marketing community, a lot of people are a little nervous about these big changes coming because it does affect the data that is being collected. And, when you get in deep dive as a strategist and you get into the analytics, this is important information. But we have to stop and remember that for some of these browsers, we've already not had that ability to collect that data with Safari and Mozilla. So, and for those who haven't noticed it, maybe it's not a bad thing. Marketing can survive, without this. And to be a good marketer, you have to be able to be agile and adapt to the environment. And this is just another change that we're going to have to adapt to. But I think a lot of marketers already have been doing that without even knowing it.
Yeah, I think market will adapt, that's for sure. But what is this nervousness or unease about in your view? Because sometimes we hear like Facebook made a statement saying it would kill the small business, or it's not good for small business. And that coming from Facebook all of a sudden caring about small business is already strange. But what do you hear? Because on one hand, we hear that these are tech companies. They have the means, they have the big pockets, and they can do it. They can bully the small companies. That's how some people put it. Then there are privacy proponents who say it was long overdue. Now the laws are there and it's good. They're falling in line. And then, of course, we have the middle view saying it's an evolution. There were no law. So companies were doing what they wanted to do. And then now with the laws, things are falling in place. And the right balance or optimum balance would be found in coming years. So how do you see and how do your customers see that?
I think what we've seen here is that this digital revolution, Google, the social media giants like Facebook, one thing that they've been enormously successful at is lowering the bar, right? It used to be that big companies that made a lot of money over time could afford the best ad spots and get placement in front of their audience easier than anybody else could. But now, with the bar being lowered and everybody having access to be able to build audiences in Facebook or to create keyword-rich ads on Google search, now you can target geographical areas that are relevant to you. You can target very, very specific things that fit your business niche and get in front of your audience that way. So what it allowed is these small to medium-sized businesses and these startups to get a footing in the business world and help grow. And I think where Ryan and I are sort of seeing some of that trepidation is they're worried they're going to lose that now. They're worried that when these features are enacted, that suddenly they're not going to be able to reach their audience anymore. And the truth is that will still be there, but it's going to evolve. It's going to be a little bit different. And one of the things that we always talk about on our podcast is the importance of building your own curated lists of subscribers, basically, of people that are interested in your product. Because if you're reliant on, let's say, Facebook, for example, and you do all your marketing through Facebook, and all of a sudden one of your ads gets flagged, right? They shut down your account. And we've seen this happen numerous times where your ads will be shut off, right? And then they'll say, all right, you are in violation of our agreement. And so you send an email and say, okay, what was the violation, right? What did I do wrong? And then 5 days later, somebody in their tech department will get back to you and say, oh, no, that was a mistake. And they turn it back on, right? But 5 days in the business world is an eternity. And you just had your ads turned off for that length of time, right? And so that's why we always preach, if you look at, places like Facebook, a lot of the social networks, as more of timeshares, like you don't really own the space. So it's okay to leverage them to reach your customers, but it's more important to be directly communicating with your customers, building up your email subscriber list, letting them opt in to what you are offering so that you have a direct line of communication with them. That's where we sort of see things shifting.
And I'll just say everything that Chris said. No, it's true. Just know it 100%. And just to add on to it, you can't rely on everything that Google and Facebook does, and that's what a lot of marketers, especially new ones, you get into that habits. And really, you need to almost start to market again. Go back 10 years, go back 15 years, and actually we've made a full circle, because there's a saying in the marketing world. The money is in the list, going to what Chris said is. Yeah. And that list is that email address list, because you own that to a certain degree. And you can use that through email marketing, but also you still have the ability to upload that email list into, let's say, a Facebook, into a Google, and target those people. At least for now you can, until they make another change, but you can't, but you still own that email list. So there's nothing wrong with email marketing. It is still highly effective, like anything, if done right and if not abused. The other thing it's going to go back to, from a marketing world, not relying on third-party cookies and not relying on this data that is controlled by Facebook and Google. It goes back to search engine optimization. SEO is very alive, and you can still bring high-quality traffic to your website, and you can get high-quality conversions through SEO. Now, it's a little bit harder, and it's a much busier landscape than it was, but you can still do it with consistency in your content. So there are ways around it. There's that still will work. And it's kind of funny that you almost have to revert a little bit back to about 10 years ago and how marketing was done, because it never actually went away. Just new shiny objects came up on the radar screen, but it still works. So I just kind of want to add that on to ways that you can still get your message and market out there around sort of the cookie issue that we're talking about.
For sure. And you talked about the email list. That's also a topic that comes up often, saying, can I buy a marketing list? Can I buy an email list? And I heard that it was possible, or it used to happen a lot before 2018, and it has kind of almost stopped or reduced to a significant effect. Is that the case? Did it happen like that? And does it happen like this now?
I think it's always been happening. And there are certain industries that for example, in the USA, the automotive industry, buying lists is commonplace. And I still think in 2021, it's still happening. Now, the downside to that is there's a little bit of spamming, which you got to be careful of, and are they going to be the most effective? Probably not. It goes back to that old pray and spray mentality. And if you throw enough things against the wall, something's bound to stick. Well, how you find email addresses is not necessarily buying it, but maybe working for it a little bit more. And what I mean by that is creating quality content. That means understanding what your audience wants, creating guides, downloadable PDFs, sending them to sign up to watch a webinar where you're going to give solutions to their problems. Those types of things of email captures are the best. And then from there, you can use your email marketing to follow up. So those we call lead magnets. And again, it's creating content that you're going to give to your audience in exchange for email addresses. And emails, it's still the marketing currency of choice, and it still can be very powerful. So those are a couple of ways where, can you buy it? Sure. Can you get some success out of it? Maybe. Is it the most effective use? Probably not.
Mm.
And I think that's the key kind of to what Ryan's saying is that, can you buy a list today in 2021? Yes, but just because you can do something doesn't mean you should. And the fact is there is still compliance law that, surrounds email. And what's going to happen the minute that you or I are on a list that some company purchases and they send us an email we don't want? I can't click that unsubscribe button fast enough, right? And that's true, I think, for the majority of us, or report spam. That's not the type of effective marketing that you want to be doing. What you want to do is trade something of value to that consumer for their email address so that they want to receive those offerings. Because if it's just sell, 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 if you're just pushing ads at them, nobody wants to be bothered with that. But if you're sharing content that is valuable to them, that will lead to them making a purchase, that's really the sweet spot.
You're talking like Gary V. Jab, jab, hook. Give them 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 pieces of content, and then the 7th one is the sell.
Yeah, and Gary Vee's right. He's not the originator of a lot of this, but he is the loudest, and
Yeah.
he's not wrong. I mean, he's absolutely right, and he's reached a whole new audience with his voice, and I think it's fantastic. And you're seeing on a global level, the world really has listened and adapted their marketing strategies based on a lot of the things that he says, and he's 100% right. And there are thousands and thousands of marketers who follow that, what he says, and are having a lot of success. And you got to earn it. I think that's the big thing. Everybody wants the easy way out. They want the magic pill, whether you're to lose weight or some sort of silver bullet. And with marketing, like weight loss, there isn't necessarily one. You do have to put the work in for it. You just can't buy your way out of it necessarily. But when you do, you also get great success, and you can do all that and abide by these privacy laws that we're seeing, across the world.
Yeah. So in context of marketing as well as privacy, so if somebody is starting up their business and they want to establish a list or get to their clients, what do you tell them? Because some people feel like stuck. They're like, oh, this GDPR, this privacy, I can't do anything. I can't even start a business. There are people like that who are staying on the fence and not getting into the water. So what do you tell them if somebody is just setting up business? How do they create a list?
The best advice that we give people is content marketing. Content is king. Create a bunch of content and give it away. And what I mean by that is typically we always like to start off people with a blog. But if you're the type of person that you're like, I don't like to write content, I'd rather create videos, or I'd rather, do what we're doing here and create a podcast, right? Those are all different forms of content. Take the time to do it and put the content out there, right? Because over time, you're building up a following. Your people are hopefully checking out the content that you're producing because it's valuable to them. And then, Ryan mentioned a lead magnet. Usually what we'll say is give away 10, 20, 30 articles that are useful in the industry, and then have a form on them that says, if you'd like the more in-depth white paper or guide or ebook or, whatever it is, fill out this form and I'll go ahead and email it to you, right? So now you're trading something of value. You're giving them more content that's sort of behind the scenes that's going to be value to them, and all you're asking for that content is their email address. That's been our method over and over again, and it works no matter what industry you're in.
That's interesting.
To add on to what Chris said too, is I think there is a mindset shift that has to happen, especially with newer businesses that are getting started. Your product and service pretty well. And what we found is they don't always know the marketing side of things.
Yeah.
And for those people, the first thing you want to do is, I think you have to change your mindset shift and think of your company as not just the company who sells widgets or has a service. You have to think of it as a media company and create content. And I think if you change it to, I have a media company that also sells widgets, I think that's going to be different. And a media company is kind of what Chris said. It's putting content out there, whether it's through a podcast, and anybody can podcast. It's the fastest growing medium right now that's out there, and podcasting is nothing new. But you can take one long form piece of content, like a podcast, like a webinar, like a blog. And here's the thing about it is you can chop that up and reuse that in different formats. So you can take sound bites, right? And we can make this podcast into a video. We can make it into a blog format. We can take 15-second snippets and we can put it on Instagram. We can create a TikTok about this. So there are so many different ways that you can use this. And I think starting a business, that is the number one thing, is it's just a mindset shift. You really are a media company first, And the reason we say this is because you have to get out there and put yourself in your company on these different platforms. It sounds overwhelming, but when you really break it down, it's really not, as it might be overwhelming for some of these small entrepreneurs.
Well, that's logical what you say. But I was talking to a CEO last week, or maybe 2 weeks ago, and he was telling me, well, it's good to do content marketing, but it doesn't give any results. So maybe he did it for, I think, 6 months or 9 months. Do you also recommend something like do it for a specific period? Because people these days also they want instant results. They have very little patience. They're like, I've done it for 6 weeks, nothing happened. So what do you recommend? I mean, do it for 2 years, 3 years, 5 years?
Oh, and that's exactly what Ryan was talking about, right? The magic pill for weight loss and things like that. No, I mean, the short answer is content alone is a 6 to 9 month strategy at a minimum, which means any content that you're producing today, you likely are not going to see the payoff on that for at least another 6 or 9 months, which means if you give up before you hit that 9 month mark, right, now you're going to have a gap in the content that you're producing and the results that you're going to see. What I would say to the CEO, if he said content marketing doesn't work, my response would be, are you creating the right content? Because if you're creating content that's valuable and your audience wants it, it will lead to sales. But if you're not getting the numbers that you expect to get, you've got to start by taking a look at the content that you're producing, right? Is it of value to the consumer? And that's where putting yourselves in the shoes of your audience, understanding who they are, what their fears and motivations are, and what they need to solve their problems becomes critical to your success in the space. Because if the content that you're producing doesn't solve that need, why would they turn to you for a more expensive product in the end?
Interesting. And now, in context of privacy, just to kind of scratch the surface a bit, we say, let's do a webinar, collect the email. That's the typical mantra from marketing people. And then I bring in a hardcore privacy professional who says, when you do a webinar, you can collect the email, but only send email about the webinar, nothing after that. Do you face that? And how do you tackle it if you face that? Because typically those people would, and even I sometimes, when it's clearly not linkable, I would say, okay, tell them webinar, but tell them, would they like to receive more emails? What do you face that? And how do you solve it?
Well, I think it depended on what the content of the webinar is. Typically, if you're doing a webinar, not always, because there's two different types of webinars you can do, but if people attend webinar, usually people who attend webinars are already familiar with you in some set. So if we're looking at a traditional funnel, your webinar is in that sort of consideration stage. You're moving slowly down closer to the sale. When you do the follow-up communication with that, it could be along those lines of, asking for the sale, or here's our trial offer if you're a SaaS company. You get it for 30 days free, something along those lines. So you can keep it along that. Oh, by the way, when you get in that SaaS, if they're trying it out, they have to create a profile in order to try out the SaaS. If it's a service, along those lines. So when you're doing a webinar, they should be pretty far down. And if you're getting that content information, I think you can communicate with them about the content of that webinar, but still push them down towards, getting closer to a sale. Because rarely, I'm not saying it doesn't happen, but you're not launching a webinar, how to something, and you're going to get a bunch of people that never heard of you. You can. It's much harder to do that than when you're promoting your webinar to an audience that you already have their email address. So again, you can do it both ways, but typically you get a higher response rate to webinars to people who you already have their email address. Not always.
Yeah, and I think to add to that, one of the keys is transparency. For any business, just be transparent. If you intend to send them other marketing content, let them know, and maybe include an additional checkbox to say, I only want to hear about the webinar, or yes, I'm interested in learning a little bit more. The other thing I would advocate for is ask. Have the webinar, but then ask them to sign up for something else. Hey, was this of value today? Would you like to learn a little bit more? Here's a form where you can be notified of, new posts on our blog, or entries on our, new podcasts that we publish, or videos or other content that we're going to produce. Ask and be transparent. And in the grand scheme of things, will your numbers on your email list be less than if you just cram everybody in there? Yes, because less people will opt in. But I would argue the quality of the people on that list is going to be much greater, and they are much more likely to be your long-term customers, which in the end is what we're looking to build, is long-term success.
Wow, that was music for my ears. It somehow felt like somebody had asked me and I was answering. So you're almost a GDPR expert now.
In this world too, I think the other thing we have to remember is it's okay to get your own firsthand research done. Don't rely on creating an audience in Facebook and seeing or looking necessarily 100% just at what Google Analytics says, what their interests are, what they have an affinity for. They're into market to purchase these things, which are all of value and should be used. But any chance that you can get your firsthand research, meaning at the end of a webinar, we want to send you a survey, understand a little bit more about them. I think that's okay too, because you're going to get that information and you can be complicit to all these GDPRs by doing that. The other thing too is you have to listen and understand what your audience is. And just going back a little bit to the person that says about the content marketing, the content could have been correct. He or she could have been sending it to the wrong audience. That's the other thing, to come back to that again. It's not that content marketing doesn't work. Either your content is right and your audience is wrong, or your audience is right, but your content wasn't hitting them correctly. So when you find the perfect in doing research and understanding who your audience is, that's when you'll see the success of content marketing. So I kind of want to go back to that and bring it in, because you can understand who your audience is by asking them questions, sending them surveys. One of the biggest thing in websites like BuzzFeed, for example, excels at is doing these quizzes. Now they do it for fun, what Kardashian are you most like, or something like that, what house of Harry Potter do you best belong in? Those are fun types of quizzes that you get a lot of engagement with, but you can take the same concept and ask your audience and learn more about them. What kind of, digital marketer are you? And you can take that information, and that is learning research about your audience. And you can develop your products and services, the next one, based off of some of these answers with it. And then one final thing that we said, and I don't want to lose this, that you mentioned about people getting ready to launch products or services or getting started in businesses. Even when you're in the process of developing your product, you should be in the process at the same time of putting content out there to collect email addresses. Don't wait until your product is getting ready to launch because you have no lists. You should be always building your list. List building should be happening on a 24/7 all the time. Don't wait for a new product to come out or your company just to launch to start that process, because you're already behind the 8 ball. So those are a couple of things I think you can help with those different areas that we sort of talked about.
That's great. And is there one consistent challenge you hear from companies in terms of privacy compliance? Because you're in the marketing world, so maybe you get more information than us, which people say, this is the pain I have in context of privacy compliance. Do you know something like that?
I think it's knowledge of all the varying laws and the regions that they're doing business in, right? GDPR applies to the EU, but then Canada has a different law. Here in the States, there's, California has a law, but the other 49 states do not. And so it becomes, how do I know what to comply with and when? And I'm worried about publishing something or sending something because I risk being out of compliance. And I think the standard advice that we give in that scenario is GDPR tends to be the standard bearer. It has the most teeth. So if you treat everything from a GDPR standpoint, you are likely to fall in compliance with everything. And so if you're looking at it through that lens, that's the best way to protect yourself.
Wow. If you start giving privacy advice, I don't know what will happen to the privacy professional. But that's good. That's almost in line with what we say. And we hear, when I talk to privacy professionals, they say technology is difficult, marketing is difficult. And when you're talking to privacy professionals, do you also feel something like they are difficult and they don't understand what you need in terms of marketing? Don't worry. I mean, it's a conversation, so
No,
you
that's a
don't
really
have to name
interesting
people.
question. I think it's a case of, two different groups of people that just happen to speak different languages. So
Yes.
it's frequently where the goal can be the same, but they're missing each other in the way that they communicate. And I think the advice that I would give to both parties in that situation is, you know what you know, right? You're an expert in your area, but try to understand what it is that the other person is trying to solve, not specifically the solution they're throwing at you. Because I think that's one thing we see often is people come at it, they try to be problem solvers and they have a solution in mind, right? Let go of the solution and accurately define the problem for both parties. Like, we're
Yeah.
trying to be compliant, but we need to reach this audience. How can we do it? And I think that helps get everybody on the same page to work on a more collective solution rather than people trying to kind of stand their ground and say, well, that's not compliant. Yes, but how else can I reach them? Otherwise you have that sort
Yeah.
of tug of war happening.
I think it's very common in especially the larger your companies begin to get, starting at the medium size up. It's not just with, your sort of privacy sector and your marketing sector and your sales sector. I think there's sort of silos that happen the larger the companies get, that there has to be more dialogue that happen in between. And it was just 10 years ago when Chris and I kind of talked the story when we were working at a company together, where Chris was a little bit more on the marketing technology side, I was on the marketing strategy side, and we realized, wait a minute, we're on two sides of the house, but we need to communicate with each other to develop a strategy and execute that strategy. And I think it's no different outside of that department than other departments, where you just have to have more communication. And I think you can do that, for every company, for every size, but especially the larger the company sizes are, the more vital it is that each department opens up that dialogue and communication.
I hear you. So in that case, if there was a data protection colleague hearing this podcast or watching this podcast, what would be your advice, saying what should they do to make it more equitable, more, as Chris said, define the problem rather than try to get into the solution, define the common objective first, because we have to get I mean, you have every right intention to be compliant, but you also want to reach the business or the client as well. So compliance as well as client, how do we find the balance? So what would you tell them then, especially the data protection colleagues, so that there's more understanding, more collaboration?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So I think I look at it through the lens of, the running joke with lawyers. If you want to know what not to do, ask a lawyer. I think, a lot of people that are in the privacy field tend to come at it from these are the things that you can't do. And I would say just reframe that, right? Tell me what I can do, so that when I come in and I'm trying to solve a problem, your perspective is more, how can I solve that, rather than, well, you can't do that and here's why, right? Help me get to that end solution.
Okay, so if I may summarize, you're saying don't tell me I can't do this, tell me what are the things I can do, and I will find a solution within that.
Yes, and hopefully it's a collaboration where you're working together to find that best solution.
Of course. And Ryan, in your view?
No, I 100% very much like that. I think in the marketing world, when you rely on creating content, when you're developing strategies, you really have to go through the guidelines of what Google says, for the most part. Follow that. I think this is a little bit the opposite. Kind of like Google does tell you pretty straightforward. Here's what not to do. They tell you a little bit in broader scale of what to do, provide better customer experience. Oh, okay, but when they get down to the details, like they get very specific, they get specific when it comes to the area of don't do this more often than they tell you what to do specifically. So I think it kind of goes along with that, and to what Chris says, you have to ask, and you have to kind of open up the communication and get a better understanding. And I think it's important for all of us is to ask more questions of each other to better understand.
I think understanding and finding the common ground is the core of any discussion, whether it's with marketing or whether it's with privacy. In essence of time, if I ask you for one final message that you would pass to companies who want to balance privacy as well as marketing, because everybody needs marketing, but it needs to be privacy compliant. So it's not an and or this kind of a choice. It's both. It has to be together. So what would be your one message? And for both of you, one message each.
So I think from my perspective, privacy is critically important. And we see companies that try to walk the gray areas of, what can I get away with? And I would say, don't do that, right? Your product, your service, it's valuable. People should want it or maybe even have a need for it. So find ways that you can reach your audience that are in compliance, because at the end of the day, you're going to create longer term relationships, and that's going to lead to longer term success of your business. And really, I think that starts with the content marketing. Tell your story and tell it through your lens, but make it available to everybody, and everybody's going to win that way.
That's a great message.
Looking through this from a marketing lens, I think it's important to look at your own data, do your own measuring. While sure, you will look at things that you do on a Google and you'll look at what happens on Facebook, but it's important that you also mine your own data. And as we kind of talked about before, build your own list. Worry about the things that you can control, and those are the things that you own. So when it's talking about sales and marketing, at the end of the day, look at the big picture. Is your revenue increasing? You can do that and measure it, but I would say let's look at your own CRM and your own data, and make sure you have that under control first before you're worrying about what the next Google change is going to be or the next Facebook change, because those things are continuously evolving and that's not going to change anytime soon.
That's good. So it's, in short, responsible marketing that's privacy compliant. That's a safe message.
Definitely, yes.
Yeah, and another safe question in this context is, because when I'm talking to privacy professionals, it's a different question. But if somebody wants to reach you, somebody wants to contact you and say, wow, Chris and Ryan, I want to talk to you about marketing advice, because you guys would ensure that the advice is also privacy compliant. So how can they reach you?
Well, the best way to reach us is through the Araxam website. That's araxam.com. But if you want to listen to more of us, you can also check out the Digital Marketing Happy Hour podcast, where we talk about all things marketing, and you can learn more there. And then, of course, Ryan and I are both accessible through LinkedIn.
Perfect. So LinkedIn, your website, and the podcast.
And then from there, yes, you could reach out to us, and we'll be definitely love to take discussions, whether it's online, through social media, LinkedIn, or even if you give us ideas. A lot of times we take those ideas and we talk about them on the podcast as well, because we figure if this is a question that you have, there are probably tons more people who have that same question.
Good. So I can definitely say that the podcast is a good one. Do take a listen if you want to learn more about marketing. And with that, I will say, Chris and Ryan, thank you so much for being with us and sharing your perspective. And it was very different for me also to have a perspective from a marketing person on how you see privacy and what's your perspective. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Punit. Our pleasure.
Thanks for listening, and now we ask you for some help. Take a moment to subscribe and review this podcast. Your support matters. And if you have done it already, thank you so much. Now, if you have questions or suggestions, drop an email at hello@fit4privacy.com. And finally, if you know someone who will benefit from this, share this podcast with them and help us grow. Thank you so much. Stay safe and see you next time.